The class of 15 began again at the early in the year on April the 4th. If you recall, I told you when we reviewed the class of 2014 that we got our first call about a bear on April the 4th. Well, this happened 2 years in a row. And on April the 4th, we got the call about two 8-week-old cubs that were observed on the side of a road very near a cliff and a large drop-off on the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina. And these were two little siblings. They weighed 3.3 pounds, the female, and her brother weighed 3.5 pounds. And the little siblings were very bonded and very protective of one another, particularly the female protecting the little male. And they were quite a pair. Some of you that followed us in 2015 remember them well. One of the things that I remember about that night was getting a call shortly before midnight from Dana saying that we had some bears that were coming and we'd have to go get them in North Carolina. And I'm assuming she's talking about maybe the next day, and she meant like right then. And she had great difficulty getting me to wake up enough and Coy to wake up enough to realize, hey, we need to go to North Carolina in the wee hours of the morning to pick up these cubs. So we left about 1 o'clock in the morning. We got there about 4, and then we gave them both a bottle and fed them, and then made the trip back to ABR. And they remained with us until September, when they returned to North Carolina. And at that point, the female weighed 61 pounds and her brother weighed 57.5 pounds. The next little cub that came in was toward the end of April. This was a 3-month-old male cub that had wandered into a backyard in Greene County and wasn't leaving. And there was no mother bear in sight. So after watching him for about 24 hours, it was really evident that he had been orphaned and he was on his own. And he was given the name Marvin after one of the TWRA officers that rescued him. And he was a very quirky cub. And he was known, and I'm sure many of you that followed then remember him for being a quirky bear. He drove the curators crazy because he wouldn't drink the formula that was so good for him, the nutritious formula. We couldn't get him to eat yogurt. We couldn't get him to eat bear diet pellets, anything that was healthy that we needed him to eat. He didn't want it. He only wanted grapes and applesauce. Drove us crazy. We tried feeding him the formula. We put honey in it. We put mixed it with grapes, everything we could, and it was nothing. It just grapes and applesauce. That's all he wanted. He did kind of grow out of that a little bit and do a little bit better as he grew up. And then he also had another quirk. We never actually saw him swimming in the pool. He would go to the edge of the pool, and the two North Carolina cubs they loved the pool. They swam all the time. And he would always be at the edge, but where the pool would flow over and fill out down this little gully in the enclosure, he would be laying in that water. It was like he was just splashing around in the mud puddle of the water that came out of the pool. So we have always referred to that as Marvin's Creek, that little gully in the enclosure that comes down from the swimming pool in enclosure 4. We call that Marvin's Creek because that's about the only time we actually saw him in water. So very quirky little bear, very beloved little bear by many folks that followed us. And he was released back to Greene County in the Viking Mountain area, and he weighed he weighed 97 pounds when he was released. The next bear that came in was actually a yearling, and this was a 16-month-old male yearling. This was about the time family breakup occurs. So obviously, as some yearlings do, he was really struggling after the breakup and struggling to find food. And he weighed 58 pounds, which was a good weight for a yearling. It was an excellent weight. But the problem was he was hanging around a dumpster at Warewood Elementary School in Wares Valley, Tennessee. So that is a problem. And it could be that mom was a bear that maybe frequented dumpsters or cabins, which would explain why he had such a healthy weight, but that was certainly not going to be a good thing for him. So we were asked to take him just for a brief time until summer foods became available and the berries. And then at that point, hopefully he would be enticed by natural foods and would stay away from the dumpsters. And I really liked this bear, and I remember Coy did too, because he behaved very much like a bear should. He was very elusive, and we were always hunting him. Of course, we didn't have the cameras then, so we were walking that enclosure constantly trying to find this little bear. And he was really known for hiding from us. And he did very well here. He stayed about 2 months. So you notice he weighed 58 pounds on May the 20th, and on July the 20th, when he left, he had doubled his weight and weighed 117 pounds when he was released. The next bear that came in was a little 5-month-old male cub that was found staggering in a road in Carter County. And I remember this little guy was on duty when he came in, and he was so severely dehydrated that he walked backwards in circles. So severe dehydration often causes neurological issues with little bears, and sometimes those are permanent, and then sometimes they're not. But I remember taking him to the vet that night, and they honestly did not expect him to live through the night. And we had to literally hold his head up and to try to help him get some formula and some nutrition and fluids. So they gave him some fluids, and he had good nutrition here. And it took a while. I remember even into the second week, we were still very concerned about him. We thought he might be blind. But it was finally to the point that he did not want to be contained in the acclimation pen anymore. The little guy wanted out. Of course, he'd been out there in the wild on his own, so he didn't understand chain link fences and an enclosure, a pen. So we talked to the vets and eventually said, well, we're going to have to determine he's either going to make it or he's not. And we'll find out how his eyesight is. And I will never forget the day that he was released out into the wild enclosure. And I believe this is the day that picture was taken. And he immediately climbed straight up a tree. And it was as if that little bear was just smiling from ear to ear. That was the happiest little bear to get out in that wild enclosure and get back up in a tree. But he was one of my favorite bears that year. Just a beautiful bear, had a dark black coat. It looked like velvet. He just absolutely beautiful bear. And he weighed 77 pounds when he was released back in Carter County. The next bear that came in was quite famous and kind of put ABR on the map nationally again. This was a 5-month-old female cub. And she'd been observed for, about a week by some rafters on the Noli River. They'd seen her alone on the banks, and she had even been trying to approach some of them as they pulled over. And she was so weak and dehydrated that eventually the rafting guide was able to get her and put her in the raft and continue paddling down the Noli River and to call TWRA to get her rescued. Now, those of us that work with bears know that a bear in a raft, even a cub, is not a good idea. So this could have ended very badly for the rafting guide and the bear, but that just shows you how weak and dehydrated and desperate that this little bear was. So she received a lot of national attention for her little rafting expedition, and she was on CNN and Fox News. Everybody carried that. So a very famous little cub. A lot of folks followed her. She was a beautiful little cub. And she was part of the 2015 foursome. I had that picture on the class of 2015 slide that you saw at the beginning of this presentation. Those four hung out a lot and were big buddies. And she was returned back to her home weighing 78 pounds when she was released. The next two little bears were siblings, and this is kind of a sad little story. Two siblings from the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and they came in after they were orphaned, after their mother had to be euthanized. And what happened is Mom had developed some bad habits of breaking into vehicles, approaching people, and she peeled back a camper top of someone's vehicle that had food in it and broke into it and did some property damage, and she had to be euthanized. So they were orphaned. And that's a sad story, but it's also a very important lesson to why we have to reduce attractants. And when you're in bear country, you don't leave food in your car. You have to be careful about leaving food out, because once bears cross that line and they start doing property damage, that we can't reverse that. And at that point, particularly, you can only relocate them so many times, and it just doesn't work. So those bears end up having to be euthanized, and it's very sad, but that's what happens. And it's very frustrating for folks who are wildlife officers or rangers when it gets to that point. And in this case, of course, it resulted in two little cubs that were orphaned, all because someone left food in a vehicle. The sisters were very timid, and 209 Summer had a beautiful white blaze on her chest. The girls were released back into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, weighing 61 pounds and 81 pounds. The next three little bears were another similar sad story. These were three siblings orphaned in Polk County, Tennessee, when their mother had to be euthanized for breaking in property. She had frequently been in campgrounds, breaking in cabins. She'd been relocated multiple times, and same story, just continued to do property damage and break in property. So she had to be euthanized, and the cubs were brought here to ABR, and they weighed 13, 16, and 17 pounds. Unfortunately, the smallest one, 210, died while she was here. Presumably a fall from a tree. We found her beneath a tree and a broken limb beside her. So a sad story for her. Her sister was released on December the 4th, weighing 76 pounds. And then the male was released on November 30th, weighing 91 and a half pounds. So three sweet little bears. Another sad story, another lesson of when we don't secure our attractants and we're not careful how we behave in bear country, how it can cause bears to get in trouble, and many lose their life, and then that often results in orphaning their cubs. The next two that came in were two brothers who originally came out of the national park, and their mother also was a bear that is often deemed a nuisance bear. And those of us who work with bears, we hate that term because it's usually the bad habits of humans that cause bears to go to that extent. But here's another lesson. This mother and her cubs were relocated. Mother continued with those habits, and she was shot after killing a farmer's chickens, getting into chickens. And again, another lesson, sometimes folks want to get upset at landowners or the farmers, but we have to understand that's their livelihood. And as I've mentioned before, bears can be quite destructive, and it's not funny or cute when it's your property or your livelihood. So another sad situation here of a bear that continued to damage property. But the brothers weighed 32 and 27 pounds, so they were really a pretty good weight for that time of year. And they grew bigger and stronger here at ABR. In fact, they were just two of the largest in their enclosure at that time. And they weighed 123 and 124 pounds, and they were released back in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This was not the last time we would hear from them. At age 2.5, it was Bear 213 that was caught on camera mating with a female. Now, prior to that, all the bear books had told us that a male bear at 2.5 years of age would not be sexually mature and would not be mating. Well, Ellis bear proved that wrong, and ABR became a little famous locally for a different kind of reason there. So Ellis doing what he can to increase the bear population in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The next bear that came in was orphaned when her mother and sibling were hit by a car on Interstate 81 in Greene County, Tennessee. She was 24 pounds, 7 months old, and joined the foursome of Marvin, Carter, and Noli while here at ABR. Sweet little bear. I remember just a sweet, quiet, pretty little bear. Weighed 97 pounds when she was released back to Greene County. The next little bear actually is one of those few that were admitted twice at ABR. This was bear 216, and she was a tiny little 16-pound cub hit by a car crossing Highway 321 here in Townsend. She recovered from a very severe concussion that they thought she wouldn't recover from. And the thing we remember most about her is she loved juicy red apples. And I remember she was so timid and skittish, and she was in an enclosure with those big boys, 213, 214. And she would stay up in the trees, and after all the other bears had eaten, then she would come down and eat. And just very timid, very skittish, and very afraid. And I remember one day throwing some apples in there, and she came flying down out of a tree, huffing and blowing at the other bears, grabbed her an apple, and immediately climbed up the tree. And one of my favorite pictures of her is climbed partially up the tree, hanging onto her apple and going ahead and eating it. She weighed 51.5 pounds when she was released. And then sadly, almost exactly 1 year later, she was hit again near the same place she was hit the first time on 321. And unfortunately, this time she could not overcome her injuries and had to be euthanized. So a very sad story of a sweet little bear. The next bear that came in, I recall that we were having a volunteer picnic here and locally. And I was at the picnic, and we got the call that little bear had been found. And I believe this bear and 216 were the first of what would become many that we would start seeing in the fall of 2015 because of a hard mast failure. So 2017 was orphaned after his mother was killed by a car. And he had survived about 2 weeks on his own when he was found in Madisonville, Tennessee. He'd been trying to make it on his own, but there wasn't enough food out there. So he was 9 months old and weighed only 16 pounds when he arrived here. When he was released, he weighed 100 pounds. One funny story about him is we had our new enclosures 3 and 4 that were relatively new to us. In the acclimation pens, we had the food wheels. And it was one of the first times that we started using the food wheel. And one time Coy had fed him, and he had forgotten to lock it back. And the little bear came out the food wheel and had escaped. And Coy, it's funnier when Coy tells the story about walking around just praying that he could find this bear. And he looked up, and there he was in a tree, still inside the main enclosure, the safety corridor where we were. So called in some reinforcements, and they were able to put a trap at the base of the tree, and ultimately he came down, and they were able to catch him. And then another funny story that I recall about this bear was when the wildlife officer brought him and dropped him off, I was showing the wildlife officer our cub houses at that time, and it was a block, and we said, we've got the concrete block, and we know that bears can't climb concrete block. And we looked in, and this little bear was climbing right up the concrete block wall. So it wasn't long after that we had to put the plexiglass over the concrete block in the cub house. So a little wily little bear here that he was, but very memorable. The next little bear came in on a very busy weekend. This was the very next day, so I'd been here that weekend. I had admitted 217, and then got the call about a little bear in Kentucky that was found wandering alone with no mother. So Dana Dodd and I drove to Kentucky and to pick up this little bear and meet the wildlife officer and brought him back. And of course, he was named Derby after the Kentucky Derby. He grew into a beautiful bear and weighed almost 76 pounds when he was returned home to Kentucky. To me, he has some very distinctive markings. It just made him a very handsome little bear. That same evening, while Dana and I were en route to Kentucky, Coy had to be called in because there was another little bear found in Sevier County. Her mother was deceased and laying in a ditch on the side of the road, and the little bear was trying to nurse her mother, and so it was thought that perhaps the mother had been hit by a car. However, 5 days later, this little bear was found dead in the acclimation pen. No signs that anything was abnormal prior to that, other than she was just another underweight little bear about that time of year. But when a necropsy was performed, they found that she had died from ethylene glycol poisoning, gotten into antifreeze. So in all likelihood, that probably killed her mother as well. And it was really after this cub that, in talking to our vets, that we started not just doing exams at the vets, but making sure that we go ahead and go that extra step and do all blood work and everything else as well, because we learned from these bears that came in, and you'll hear some more stories coming up. You don't know what starving bears have been getting into and eating. They're so desperate for food. And as I said, we were in a hard mast failure, so there wasn't a lot of food out there. So the bears were getting into trash. They were getting into anything that they thought that they could eat. And so obviously some things that could kill them. The next bear that came in, bear 220, was another one of the many starving cubs that just started coming, one right after the other. And you'll notice these admittance dates, how quickly they were coming in, several a week. And she weighed 24 pounds, was found in Maryville, Tennessee, with no sign of a mother. She weighed 74 pounds when she was released back to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Bear 221 was a 9-month-old male cub that had been observed in a resident's backyard for more than a week. He weighed only 16.5 pounds and was just barely surviving. He was the second cub in ABR history to be rescued from Gamble Lane in Maryville, Tennessee. So this is Gamble the second, and he was released in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park weighing 84 pounds. Bear 222, another severely malnourished little cub found in a cedar tree near the Rocky Top Shale in Vonore, Tennessee. She weighed only 7.7 pounds. So this is when we started seeing the worst of the worst that were coming in. We're into November now. There's no acorns on the ground. There's no food for them. So you're going to start seeing a difference in the weights of these little bears that are coming in. She did recover, and as you can see, became a beautiful little bear, a very fluffy little bear, more fur than bones and tissue as she began to grow, but just a gorgeous little bear. And she was released in the spring of 2016, weighing 57 pounds. Bear 223, orphan male cub, another one that wandered into a residential area in Maryville, Tennessee. And keep in mind, Maryville backs up to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So that's why when there's no food available, they just keep coming to the lower elevations, which eventually brings them into residential areas. This little guy only weighed 8 pounds and was, of course, starving and exhausted. He also recovered and was released in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in the spring of 2016, weighing 61 pounds. Bear 224, Rufus, was an orphan 10-month-old male cub, wandered into a residential area, again in Maryville, Tennessee. Little 9-pound cub was starving and full of parasites, just like many that we had at that time. He also recovered, was released in the national park, and he weighed 62 pounds. And these particular cubs this year, there were several in Wild Enclosure 1, and they were some of the few that ever stayed even into the winter that actually used the dens. as you can see, of all the cedar shavings all over his coat. And a lot of times when we saw him, he was covered in cedar shavings. Bear 225, little orphan 10-month-old female found on a road in Greenback, Tennessee. She weighed only 10 pounds and was really struggling to survive on her own. And when she was released, she weighed 62.5 pounds. And I love this picture of her. It almost makes her look like a cat with the fur just all around her face, but a very pretty little cub. Bear 226, nicknamed Tiny Tim, another victim of the hard mass failure, was found wandering and starving in Maryville. He weighed only 11 pounds, and he was so tiny, he looked more like a cub of 3 or 4 months of age rather than a bear that was 10 months old. He loved the trees, and we often found him sleeping on a limb. And I don't know that we have many pictures of him where we actually have his face. He was always usually sleeping on a limb or elusive. He weighed 73 pounds when he was released in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in April of 2016. Sad note about this little bear, in November of 2018, I was here at ABR and we got a call that a bear had been hit on Highway 321, not far from our facility. And I went to check it. We knew that it had ear tags, green ear tags. I went to check it, and my heart sunk because I knew immediately it was one of ours. And when I checked the ear tag number, it was Bear 226. So sadly, he had been hit by a car and was deceased. On a good note, this little bear was released in April of 2016. So he had survived out there 2 years. Post-release, which we always wonder, how they do after they're released. He was very healthy. He was beautiful, full coat of hair, a really good weight on him. So he had been doing well out there, but sadly, as happens to many in this area where we have so many visitors to our national park, he was hit by a car. Number 227, this little bear, I remember him well when he came in. 10-month-old male cub found on West Millers Cove Road in Blount County. He was so malnourished and full of parasites. He had a very strong odor, almost like rotting meat. It was just a terrible odor. And numerous parasites were eliminated by this little guy from the dewormer he was given. So he really was having a tough time. He was a very elusive little cub. You usually found him high in the trees, sleeping on a favorite limb, but turned into a beautiful little bear. And when I look at this picture of him, it looks nothing like the little bear that came in that night. He just looked and smelled like death when he arrived. So he did well. He recovered and weighed 76 pounds when he was released back to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Bear 228, sad story. This little bear was really a victim of the hard mass failure, one that didn't survive. She was severely emaciated. She weighed only 9 pounds and was anemic and malnourished. She also had some previously healed injuries to her right hip and femur, swollen elbow joint, and several broken teeth. And she had fought hard to try to survive out there, but you can see how tiny she is at 10 months of age and see her size. But she just had nothing left, and she had to be euthanized by our vets at UT. And you can see, even though you don't see the faces of the vets in this picture, it just speaks at their compassion and how much we all hate when it comes to that point that we can't help a little bear. But sometimes the best thing you can do is let them go. Bear 229, 10-month-old female weighing almost 20 pounds, was the lone survivor when her mother and sibling were hit by a car near Gatlinburg. She was a very timid bear, and when you would go to feed her, I remember the day I took this picture, she was in one of the perimeter pens, and she would immediately crawl in her little log and hide. I remember Bill Stiver telling me one time this was one of his favorite pictures of some of our bears here. And she remained timid her whole time here and elusive. She shared an enclosure with Tedford, Derby, Pumpkin, and Acorn while she was here at ABR. She was released in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, weighing almost 70 pounds. Bear 230, nicknamed Acorn, was a 10-month-old female found in a residential area in Maryville. She weighed 30 pounds when she was admitted, so that's a better weight than many that we were seeing come in. However, with the hard mass failure, she would not have been able to fatten up enough to have survived winter on her own, even at 30 pounds. So she stayed here with us till the spring of 2016 when she was released to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, weighing 63 pounds. Bear 231 was found in Sevier County, Tennessee, struggling to find food. He weighed only 16.5 pounds, and the thing I remember most about him is he always looked like he had chronic bedhead. He just always looked bedraggled, and this was his look. And that he was healthy, had a very healthy coat, but he just looked, always looked more lion than bear to me. So, but he always kind of had this look about him. He was released in the spring of 2016, weighing 71 pounds. Bear 232 was with his sibling when his mother broke into a cabin in Townsend, Tennessee, looking for food. He was the only member of the family apprehended. And there again, had the mother been apprehended, it's likely she would have been euthanized. So she escaped that. But he found lots of food here while at ABR and lots of friends that he had in the enclosure with the other bears. He was released in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in February of 2016, weighing 91 pounds. The next two are two bears that Coy and I don't really like to talk about, but it's part of the history, so we just have to do it. Bears 233 and 234 were orphaned when their mother was killed by a landowner in Washington County, Tennessee. They both weighed more than 40 pounds, so they were of good, healthy weight. And with all the other bears out there starving and a hard mass failure, for these girls to weigh 40 pounds, that tells you this family had found a really good food source somewhere. So it may have been someone's livestock or trash, or maybe mom had been breaking into cabins or dumpsters, who knows, but they were a very healthy weight. They were scheduled to be released on January the 15th, but overnight from Sunday evening to Monday morning, there was a severe thunderstorm that came down here in Townsend and brought down a large limb that landed on the electric fence and just sort of created a bridge. And it was a little too tempting, so the girls chose to self-release, and they were never heard from again. Of course, we drove around looking for them. They had ear tags, but they were never seen or heard from, so we assume they either went to the national park nearby or made their way back to Washington County. But we wish them well, but these became our first escapees since Coy and I were here at ABR. Bear 235, little Zellie, has a unique face. Here, I always remember her unique facial appearance. She was an 11-month-old female found wandering in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, weighing only 10 pounds. And she was almost to the end of her rope, could not have survived much longer. She weighed 60 pounds when she was released to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Bear 236, this one was famous among our Facebook supporters. He arrived weighing 12 pounds, and he suffered from some intestinal issues and blockages due to having eaten some trash, and it took several visits, several procedures to get him through that, and there were several times we didn't think he was going to survive. But he was captured near a golf course in Maryville, Tennessee. And in his wild enclosure, he had a favorite stump that we still refer to as Milo's stump. And he's remembered by a lot of folks because we tried to release him 2 months earlier than he went, but he kept outsmarting the curators trying to capture him for his release. But he'd been in that enclosure and he'd watched all the other bears go in that acclimation pen and not come back. So he was a smart bear and a fan favorite. He weighed 68 pounds when released in the national park. He was part of all these bears were, with the exception of the North Carolina cubs. They were a part of the collar study that we did with the 2015-16 bears. So he was one of those 42 that were collared. And a day or so after he was released, his collar gave a mortality signal, which means that it hasn't moved in a period of time. And Coy went to check it. He found the collar laying in the creek next to a pile of scat. So Milo got the last word. The last bear that would be admitted in 2015 was bear 237. He was captured at the Big Valley Resort in Townsend, Tennessee, and weighed only 12 pounds. Again, another malnourished, dehydrated bear full of parasites. Sad ending for him. He fell from a tree in Wild Enclosure 3 and died from his injuries. So our year ended on a sad note. Many of the little bears that came in had a really tough time. They'd struggled to survive. We had some that didn't survive, some that died here, and likely, these little bears, they didn't have good muscle tone where they had been so weak and dehydrated and malnourished, and that may have led to a couple of those that had fallen from a tree that may have contributed some to that. We don't know. But hope you